So we're starting at the very beginning with assessment, and we're going to start with special education, some history, legislation, and how that affects consideration for eligibility. Specifically, we're going to look at how our understanding of assessment and eligibility for special education services relates to general education legislation, civil rights legislation, and special education legislation. Now, by the time you've finished this week's work, going through the readings and practicing your vocabulary and practicing for your assessment, you will be able to do the following. First, you should be able to identify key points and events in history that have shaped special education. You want to be able to identify the key principles of IDEA and describe the purpose of Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I want you to be able to define the categories of disability served under IDEA, and that's what we did in class on Tuesday night. I want you to be able to discuss the difference between an Individualized Family Service Plan, or IFSP, and the IEP, and a Section 504 service agreement. So by the end of the week, you should be able to do those things. If you're checking yourself and you're not able to do one of those things, then go back to the text and go back to the readings and try and make sure that you can articulate those clearly. So for us in this context, we're really looking at assessment and the understanding that this can make a major difference for students with disabilities. Part of why we're assessing is to understand how a student learns. And we're going to look at some different domains for evaluating students and some different forms of assessment. But there's been some evolution in what special education is and looks like, and some really pivotal court cases. Now, the other thing to look at is some legislation as it relates to assessment is going to be some of this federal education legislation. For instance, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, of course that was in 1965. This is going to be key for us. We move up to No Child Left Behind. This was the first kind of big act that said, hey, we actually have to assess students with disabilities in the same way that we assess students without disabilities to measure progress, and that was a big deal. And then most recently, the Every Student Succeeds Act. So we want to make sure that you're familiar really with all of those. Now, the big civil rights legislation that affects disabilities or students with disabilities most often is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. What that does is that it provides for the evaluation, identification, and assessment process to not exclude children with disabilities. Then we've got the Americans with Disabilities Act. This provided equal opportunities for all people with disabilities and helped to protect against discrimination, and that includes students. Our big law, of course, is IDEA. The passage of IDEA that special education principles and policies really begin to take hold, and there are 6 major principles that we talk about with IDEA. The first is zero reject, and this means that the school district has to provide for all children from birth to 21 an appropriate public education, regardless of the severity of disability. The second one is non-discriminatory evaluation, and this is really important with regard to assessment because it requires that the schools use assessments that are non-biased based on race, culture, and native language, and that we use multiple methods of evaluation. So we can't just use one test to place a child within special education. And the next one is a free appropriate public education. We call that FAPE a lot of times. And this means that the free appropriate public education is available to all children regardless of the severity of disabilities. And then least restrictive environment, or LRE. This means that students with disabilities need to be educated in the least restrictive environment, and the emphasis is on putting those students to learn with children with disabilities and without disabilities to the maximum extent possible. Next is procedural safeguards, and this ensures the protections of the rights of the family and the child with disabilities. This means that parents get to consent for evaluations. They have a say in placement decisions. The records have to be confidential, and the parents can have them whenever they want. And parents have a right to due process. Means that there are options available to them when the school and the parents disagree about what a child needs. And finally, parental participation. This means that schools have to collaborate with the parents and children who have disabilities in everything from the design of the IEP in education to the implementation of special education services. So again, these are the 6 principles of IDEA, and you must commit these to memory. In addition to those 6 principles of IDEA, we actually look to IDEA 2004 for what sets the standard for how we identify children with disabilities and what are the eligibility categories. We look at section 300.8, and that part of the law says there are 14 categories of disability, and we define a child with a disability as, this is the federal language, a child evaluated in accordance with 300.304 through 300.311 as having an intellectual disability, a hearing impairment including deafness, a speech or language impairment, a visual impairment including blindness, a serious emotional disturbance referred to in this part as emotional disturbance, an orthopedic impairment, autism, traumatic brain injury, as an other health impairment, a specific learning disability, deaf blindness, or multiple disabilities, and who, by reason thereof, need special education-related services. What you'll see throughout the definitions repeatedly is that the disability has to have an adverse effect on their ability to learn in order to qualify them for special education services. Now go back to the Kahoot, practice those categories, make sure you have those 14 categories committed to memory. You can identify which one is which at any point. So if a child is found to be eligible for special education services and they need those services, they can have either an individualized education program or an individualized family service plan, and this has to be developed and implemented. If they have a disability, but they don't necessarily need specially designed instruction, like what we would get under IDEA, they can receive accommodations under Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973 through a 504 service agreement. Let's look a little bit more closely at what's actually in the IEP. We start with present levels of performance, measurable annual goals. There has to be a statement of progress. There has to be a statement about how special education and related services are going to help students attain their annual goals, how they're going to make progress in the gen ed curriculum, how they'll participate in extracurricular or non-academic activities, and how they will get to participate and to what extent with children who don't have disabilities. In the IEP, we also have to outline any related services like transportation, speech pathology, audiology, occupational therapy, lots of other things, or any supplementary aids and services that help the child access the curriculum, extracurricular or non-academic activities. There also has to be a description of any testing accommodations or changes that are going to be made to the student's participation in the statewide or district assessments. And we have to document the delivery of services, when they are going to begin, how often they're going to happen, and where they're going to occur. Transition services also have to be included in the IEP when this child turns 16 or earlier if deemed appropriate. Honestly, we usually start at 14 for that. Remember, these are school-age children who get the IEP. For children who are ages 0 to 2, we've got Part C of IDEA, which allows for us to create individualized family service plans. Look to your text to look at that in a little more detail. It's most of the same stuff included, with the exception of we add some things like information about the family's resources and priorities, and information on what the family's going to be doing. We include our goals relate to the family much more in those. What we've got is a pretty significant and rich history of advocacy and laws that have really brought us to where we are right now with special education services. But the special education law is very clear on the procedures for how we initially identify students with disabilities, how we evaluate any of those students, and the law requires strict adherence to these guidelines because we need to ensure that students who have special education needs, who have disabilities, receive the most appropriate services that are unique to their needs. That's why it's individualized. The law further states that it is super important to develop the IEP for instruction that takes into consideration the specific characteristics of the individual.